Hi, I'm Cici. The study I'm going to present is Home Ownership Gap Between Immigrant and the Canadian-Born, Implication for Canada's Housing Strategy. This study aims to answer how the 6 percentage point immigrant native home ownership gap in 2016 had been produced, and how the $40 billion 10-year national housing strategy could possibly reduce this gap. This presentation is structured as follows. Introduction, research objectives, data and methodology, lastly, result and policy implication. First, we want to look at why is immigrant home ownership important? Becoming a homeowner is one of the most important events in immigrant integration process. As many of the articles suggest, immigrant households have lower home ownership rate than native households. Besides, Canada starts to welcome more immigrants. This will lead to an increased housing demand among immigrants. For these reasons, low access to home ownership for immigrants and systematic disparities in home ownership rates between the native-born and immigrant is cause for major concern. Although there are supportive housing policies in place, they appear to be less helpful for immigrants. Firstly, Home Buyers Plan. It allows first-time home buyers to withdraw from their RRSP contributions and use the amount for a down payment. Since immigrants have probably not had an opportunity to build RRSP, they will likely not benefit greatly from this program. Secondly, first-time home buyer tax credit. It provides a $750 tax credit, and it is too small to dramatically affect the home ownership rate. Lastly, the Government of Canada has recently instituted its $40 billion 10-year national housing strategy. Under the strategy, the first-time home buyer incentive has been introduced, even though the maximum eligible home price has been recently increased. The changes may not have the desired effect, because home prices have risen dramatically during the pandemic, especially in top immigration destinations. Then let's move to the research objectives. Recent empirical studies investigating immigrant home ownership in Canada are scarce. Therefore, this study aims to fill this research gap. It aims to decompose the immigrant native home ownership gap using a multivariate decomposition method, and to identify policy implications with specific quantified goals, which are not provided by conventional simple regression analysis. That is, to quantify the extent to which specific policy intervention could reduce the immigrant native home ownership gap. Then let's move to the data and methodology part. This study used a confidential master file of the 2016 Census of Canada. In order to be included in the study sample, the person must be a primary household maintainer, either immigrant or the native-born. For immigrant, I only included those who arrived in Canada after 1980 and aged between 18 to 65. Now let's talk about methodology. The multivariate decomposition for logit model involves two steps. For the first step, I estimated a logit model. The probability of home ownership is influenced by a variety of variables. Common with the home ownership literature, I categorized the variables in three different groups: demographic, socioeconomic, and locational characteristics. For the second step, I decomposed the immigrant native home ownership gap. This allows us to find out how much of the gap can be explained by the differences in the above-mentioned characteristics. The remaining residual part may reflect the differences in coefficient or unobserved variables. The analysis is based on the data command MVDCMP, which extends the widely used Oaxaca-Blender decomposition method for linear regression to nonlinear models. So now let's move to the fun part, result and policy implication. This figure provides a description of my sample. First, the average local household income for native is 11.2, while immigrant is 11. We can see that immigrant had home ownership rate of 62% compared to 68% of the native born. So it indicates a 6 percentage point home ownership gap here. The majority of immigrants are represented in MTV, which are Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Immigrants are largely visible minority. Large difference can be observed in location of study. 42% of the immigrants received their highest degree outside Canada, compared to only 4% of the native born. Presence of children and currently married are more prevalent among immigrants than among the native born. For the other variables, immigrant and the native born show quite similar distributions. This figure shows the aggregated decomposition result. The immigrant-native home ownership gap was decomposed to 69% of difference in characteristic attributable gap and 31% of differences in coefficient attributable gap. This result implied that the gap in home ownership could be reduced by 69% if the immigrant group becomes equivalent to the native-born in all the covariates in the logit model. This figure reports the detailed decomposition result. The immigrant-native difference in variables above the axis were attributed to the increase in the gap. On the other hand, variables below the axis were attributed to the reduction in this gap. Among all the characteristics, living MTV, logged household income, and location of study had the largest magnitude of contributions. Therefore, the following analysis focuses on these three characteristics. We first look at living MTV. From the descriptive result, we can see that 65% of the immigrants live in MTV, compared to only 26% of the native-born. This immigrant-native difference was attributed to 27% of the home ownership gap. In other words, 27% of the gap would be expected to reduce if immigrants were equal to the native-born on the distribution of living MTV. Therefore, policy may focus on incentivizing immigrants to settle and purchase home outside MTV. For example, provide tax credit or down payment subsidies to those first-time home buyers who settle and purchase home outside MTV. Besides, other than housing policy, provincial nominee programs could also help with directing immigrants to settle outside MTV. Logged household income. We can see that average logged household income among immigrants is 11 and 11.2 for the native-born. This difference was attributed to 25% of the home ownership gap. In other words, 25% of the gap would be expected to reduce by equalizing the average logged household income. So the long-term policy implication is to increase immigrant household income. However, this is not easy and takes time. The short-term measure could be providing income tax credit to immigrants. More specifically, eligible immigrant first-time home buyer could claim to get back their income tax that they have paid before to use toward a down payment and then pay back the amount in the future. Lastly, location of study. We can see that 42% of immigrants received their highest degree outside Canada, compared to only 4% of the native-born. This difference was attributed to 57% of the home ownership gap. In other words, 57% of the gap would be expected to reduce if immigrants were equal to native-born on the distribution of location of study. This result has important implications for the two-step immigration process in Canada, where people come into Canada on a temporary work permit or study visa and subsequently gain permanent resident status. Increased proportion of immigrants who were previously international students would increase the chance for immigrants to receive their highest degree in Canada. Consequently, this may mitigate the gap in immigrant native home ownership. Therefore, the government should provide easier pathway to permanent residency for international students. Thank you for watching this presentation. Bye.